the withdrawal agreement is being considered. As you know, Parliament gave it a resounding rejection by 400 plus votes to 220. And I cannot put it better than the leader of the opposition. Mr. Corbyn, after he met the Prime Minister on the 30th of January, pointed out this would be the first time in British history we had entered into a treaty arrangement with anybody else in which there was no right to leave, because it would be a decision that could only be made by the other side. I think Mr. Corbyn put that very well in an interview with the BBC after his meeting. We must ask, therefore, and some of the work we've done is on the why has our system failed? Why have we got to a state that we have a proposed treaty in international law which has got where it has, almost at the 11th hour, being pulled up by our legislature tool? But just today, I want to mention two matters to set the context for our debate. Our constitutional system, our democratic system, has checks and balances. We have many checks and balances, and they have one single purpose. It's to protect people's freedom, their right to have a say in shaping their law, their right to freedom under the law, their right, indeed, to protect themselves against arbitrary government. And in my view, and I speak not as a lawyer, but as a historian, we have seen the exercise of arbitrary government this year. We have seen an executive which neglected collective cabinet responsibility to make proposals behind closed doors by unelected officials and bamboozle, if I may say, cabinet ministers, ministers of the Crown, who are there not only as our elected MPs, but as responsible for policy and determining how it is shaped before it goes to the House of Commons. That this did not happen for the fateful Chequers plan in July, or indeed for the withdrawal agreement until the 11th hour, suggests that constitutional arrangements in this country have fallen far short of what they ought to be. And now the matter remains with Parliament. Just as I close, when the country voted to leave the European Union, and it voted to leave, it voted to bring back control of its laws, including its economic laws, the laws under which the future direction of Britain's economy would develop. Now, it will be for the people themselves to decide whether they want a Labour system of government, where you might have a more collective approach, a more state-oriented approach to Britain's economy, or to the Conservative government, who might traditionally stand for a market-oriented. But that decision will be taken by the people of this country, not those in the European Union. What we are in danger of doing is handing the whole direction of our economy and many other things to the European Union, which has a different approach entirely, which is centrally controlled from Brussels, and which has no respect for what people in this country want to do. And people in this country are perfectly capable of making their own decisions and honouring them. I'll give you 3 examples from the 20th century when they took that decision to make a radical change. In 1923, they voted in the first Labour government in British history and sent the Liberal Party, the great Liberal Party, packing. They voted Labour again in 1945 in a very large majority, and that was a signal they wanted a more collective type of economy. After a few decades of that, they made a reversal and put in Margaret Thatcher to bring a more market-oriented policy. But I leave you to the panel now, because people in this country can decide for themselves what sort of economic rule they want. And it should not, in my view, be left to Brussels to decide for us. And I'm going to ask Martin Howe to open the proceedings, and then we will go through the panel.
Well, good morning, Sheila, and thank you very much for inviting me back again to speak to Politeia. And all I can say is plus ça change, mais c'est la même chose. Every single time I have been spoken Politeia, we have been in a state of shambles and uncertainty in the Brexit process. and the same backdrop of the most serially incompetent execution of the process of leaving the European Union that is possible to imagine. Indeed, it was impossible to imagine in advance until it happened. You often nowadays you come across people who've gone on a negotiation course on how to learn how to negotiate, and they tell you all these things that they've learnt. And I tend to do negotiation as part of my job, because it's part of the role, and it's often very, very stressful. What I think we can do with these negotiation courses is we could take the process by which the British government has negotiated exit from the European Union as a work study example of how not to negotiate at every single possible level. How not to have a credible fallback, no deal fallback. About how not to have your finance director making publications while you're negotiating with the other side, about how he's not going to spend any money on alternative arrangements, and about how terrible it is if you don't get a deal. Endless we could go on. About how not agreeing to the other side's timetable under which you agree all the things they want before you get to talk about the things you want. I could go on with the list of endless serial incompetence, at best, in the way the negotiations have been conducted. And they have ended up with overall a deal consisting of the withdrawal agreement treaty and the political declaration, which is absolutely atrocious. It is worse, from my perspective as an advocate of leaving the European Union, it is worse than staying in as a member. And the reason is that at least there's a logical coherence of staying in as a member, because you have a vote, even though you can be outvoted. You have a vote on future developments. There is simply no case. The case for leaving the European Union is in order to leave and have freedom to decide for yourselves, both on your domestic policy, as Sheila mentioned, left versus right. That should be a decision for the British people, not for foreigners or for treaties we're bound to. And indeed on our international policy, particularly international trade policy. There is simply no case at all for nominally leaving the European Union, losing the vote, and then being subjected to following the rules without having a vote on them. And it is compounded, of course, by the quite remarkable feature of this withdrawal agreement, making it unlike any other trade treaty, as far as I know, that has ever been signed in the world, in not allowing the parties to withdraw on notice. This idea of the so-called backstop having no exit clause. This is the heart of the problem. It is not the only problem. A week ago, the Brady Amendment was passed, and that, at least across the Conservative Party and their DUP allies, attracted near unanimous support. The Prime Minister herself voted for it and whipped her party to vote for it. And that says, in simple terms, that the House would support a withdrawal agreement if the Northern Ireland backstop protocol is replaced. What is extremely disturbing, both in a Telegraph article at the weekend by the Prime Minister and even more so by what she said yesterday in Northern Ireland, is that in the Prime Minister's word, the word replace seems to have been washed out of her consciousness, and she is talking instead that Parliament asked for the backstop protocol to be changed. No, those were not the words used by Parliament. Parliament did not ask for the backstop protocol to be changed. Parliament asked for it to be replaced. But then when we get to the word changed, there's a further problem here. The withdrawal agreement and the backstop protocol are intended to be, once ratified, a legally binding treaty. The only way you can modify a legally binding treaty is by changing the treaty text or by having another treaty at the same level which overrides or changes the text. Actually, the mechanics of whether it's in the same document or different document is secondary. What you can't do is keep the same treaty and have some sort of other instrument like an interpretive declaration, which it seems that they're up to, which will not achieve anything of value. And let me explain very briefly why. Because it is possible to get into labyrinthine discussions on whether or not an interpretative declaration relating to a treaty has legal effects in international law. It's possible to go and register such a document at the UN and then talk about it as if it has something of value. But such a document cannot solve the backstop problem for a very simple reason. The problem with the backstop is that the UK has no exit from it except by an agreement between the UK and the European Union. There is a commitment by both parties to negotiate in good faith, but there is not and there cannot possibly be an obligation to reach an agreement, because an obligation on two parties to agree with each other is not justiciable. Because if they each pursue their own legitimate interests, they fail to reach an agreement, then you cannot allocate blame to one or the other. That's just life. There's a deadlock. And in the Attorney General's private advice to the Cabinet, which is very well constructed, he deals with exactly this problem, and he explains that in these circumstances, the UK would be locked into the protocol indefinitely. And I'm afraid what I fear now is that having the Brady Amendment behind her and a mandate from the House to ask for a substantive replacement to the protocol, the Prime Minister will not even go back and ask for that. She won't even ask for a substantive treaty change. She will simply ask for a completely worthless interpretive document, and then use that. That will not advance the United Kingdom's interest one iota. It will simply be used as an exercise in perception management and yet another attempt to get what is the same deal through the House of Commons. And I fear she will simply throw away the chance that has handed her, the last chance to get a deal which could be acceptable. That then leads us to the territory of no deal. My view, and I won't elaborate this, is that it's obviously less desirable than a good deal, but it is way, way, way better than Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. And the ludicrous Project Fear arguments have been hugely overstated. As far as disruption is concerned, that looks as if it will be much, much less than if it happens at all, than is feared. And in terms of its long-term effects, the downside of it is tariffs, which would be required, the EU required to impose tariffs on UK exports. The UK would be required to apply whatever are our MFN tariffs, in other words, rest of world tariffs, to imports from the EU. But people make a huge and unjustified assumption that the UK would maintain the same external tariffs as we are now compelled to maintain under the European Union's common external tariffs. I've been saying for months and months and months that this is an insane assumption, it won't happen. And in the last few days, we now have news that indeed the government will not maintain the same tariffs. I don't know exactly what they've cooked up, and they've probably loused it up like everything else they've done. But at least they are paying attention to the idea of it's pointless imposing tariffs, for example, on goods or products we don't make or grow in this country at all, and that it is pointless maintaining EU-like level tariffs and imposing them on EU imports, if that's going to cause consumer prices to shoot up in this country. And while, for example, farmers in the UK may need some continued level of protection against rest of the world imports, it can be done in such a way, a lower level of tariffs on both EU and rest of the world imports that leave prices roughly where they are and leave them undisturbed. So finally, of course, the last refuge is the subject of an Article 50 extension, which now seems to be the flavour of the month. I'll very briefly just talk about the legalities of that and sit down. Now, internally, in our own domestic law, an Article 50 extension can be approved by an affirmative resolution of each House of Parliament. That's the mechanism under the 2018 Withdrawal Act. However, that requires the prior agreement of the European Union to an extension, and the assumption that all we need to do is ask, and unto us will be given what we ask in terms of an extension, is, in my view, unwarranted. The requirement, if an extension, the effect of an extension of Article 50 is that we remain full members with a vote of the European Union until over the extended period. Therefore, if the extension takes us past the 2nd of July, on the face of it, we are both entitled to and indeed required to hold further elections for the European Parliament. And the European Union have convinced themselves that if Mr. Farage is re-elected, which appears inevitable in those circumstances, he and his cohort will then be entitled to stay in the European Parliament for the whole of their ensuing 5-year terms, irrespective of the date when the United Kingdom leaves. And this, as you might imagine, is something of a concern from their point of view, particularly as they've already agreed plans for carving up the seats they expected to be vacated by the United Kingdom. So the idea that they're just going to blithely, I mean the Cooper Amendment and the bill that it relates to, blithely assume that the European Council will agree to any old date requested, or 31st December of this year. And the idea they will blithely agree to such a date is a bit of an assumption, if I can put it that way. If you look at the other end and say, okay, well, what about a short extension, take us just short of the 2nd of July? Very little point in it, because a withdrawal agreement needs an affirmative vote of the European Parliament in order to be legal under EU law. The European Parliament's last day of sitting is the 18th of April. And after that, it dissolves prior to the European Parliament elections. That adds only 3 working weeks to the existing exit date of the 29th of March. So the best you get from a 3-month extension is an extra 3 weeks of negotiating time. And it's worse than that, because if we ask for an extension, each individual member state has a veto. It requires a unanimity. The Spanish have already dropped very, very heavy hints that in the event of an Article 50 extension request by the United Kingdom, they would want to attach conditions regarding permanent concessions on Gibraltar. I gave evidence to the European Union Committee of the Bundestag about 3 weeks ago, and one subject they were discussing was an Article 50 extension, and some of the German experts who were giving evidence to the committee said, well, what you need to do if the UK asks for an extension, any extension of Article 50, attach a condition that the UK will agree unconditionally to payment of the financial provisions in the withdrawal agreement. So whether or not the agreement is subsequently signed or not, deal or no deal, we would be signing a cheque to pay. Now, I must say, if Germany were my client, I'd be advising them to take that course. But we shall see. Thank you.
Martin, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thought I'd begin by doing a bit more of a formal speech with my ideas and give a bit of insight on where we're going with things. And at the end, I thought I'd do a bit of an unscripted, give you an up-to-date briefing really on what's happened this week in the Brexit committee when we went over to Brussels, what's going on in Parliament, because I'm sure the juicy gossip side you're interested in as well. So now, in my view, the British people are tired, they've had enough, and they've had enough of the endless scheming by politicians who are actually seeking to reverse the referendum result. They want out, and they want out now. And I wholeheartedly agree with them. Now, it's a shame that after 2 years, what have we got? We've got this disastrous withdrawal agreement, as Martin's described. And this, for us Brexiteers, contains numerous breaches of the red lines throughout the process. Now, we've been open and honest about what our red lines were. In the background, for the last 2 years, as Brexiteers have met with Number 10, we've met with the Chief Whip, and I know the brilliant Sammy Wilson's at the back from the DUP. The DUP have also met with them and put the red lines, but everything that we've done has fallen on deaf ears. Now, firstly, the Northern Ireland backstop. This was called the insurance policy, and that's the line the EU was even using this week. In my view, it's dangerous for the UK, as it could have an effect of driving one part of the UK apart from the rest, and that's not good enough, really. In other words, it fatally compromises the integrity of our union, and it does this by aligning Northern Ireland with the Republic of Ireland rather than with Britain. Now, in such a sensitive and politically fragile area, there should be no ambiguity about our commitment to the solutions that the Good Friday Agreement provided. The backstop inevitably will alter the political and emotional landscape of this region. It is therefore too big a risk to take, in my opinion, and I'm clear that this backstop, if it comes into existence, will not mediate the problem. It'll actually make it a lot worse. Now, in its place, we could make the use of technological innovative solutions. I know the likes of Owen Paterson, Ian Duncan-Smith, they've been across the EU looking at borders there. These alternative arrangements could include an expansion of a trusted trader scheme and an uptake of far-field communication tracking. Now, in addition, where random custom checks are necessary, they could take place away from the border, thus removing the important psychological and emotional impact of a visible hard border. Now, what also actually puts it into context as well, Sinn Féin, I'm on Peston Show with them tonight, but they seem to be giving them a lot of airtime at the moment, the British media do. Now, they've got leaflets out there, which I've seen, where they've actually really trying to put the fear of God into their own local people by having leaflets with a wall being built with armed guards there, and making out that this is what is going to happen. So it shows you the danger, really, if we allow the Prime Minister to use this so-called backstop, which will no doubt break our union, because the Sinn Féin are no doubt going to try and use this to have a united Ireland, which, like colleagues like Sammy in here, that's the thing we don't want. We want to remain part of the United Kingdom. Now, it's true to say that technological is not fully developed at the moment, but in the meantime, why can't we use common sense? Is it not the case that these two close neighbours, both with developed economies, can operate with a mutual trust and respect for the rule of law? We trust people to take the VAT, we trust businesses, why can't we trust them over this in the short term? Surely it's less of a risk than to irritate the fragile political situation, which can have potentially devastating consequences. Now, secondly, regarding the withdrawal agreement, I don't believe the 39 billion we are required to pay alongside the deal is either fair or it represents good value for money. Martin mentioned it. To put it in context, this is actually £60 million, more than £60 million per constituency. I know how I'd like to spend that in my area. I know that my constituents like to see that invested in the area, not sent over to bureaucrats in Brussels. Now, we could better spend it in our own communities. Now, I accept that there's some legal obligations. We should, of course, settle these. But negotiations are about give and take, and I believe that the deal would mean that we've given far too much. We've seen this. Negotiations, it's been appallingly handled. I actually wish we had as strong negotiators as the EU got on our side, because our negotiators have put the EU over the needs of our own country, in my opinion. Now, there's also serious questions to be asked on how much influence the EU will retain over the UK after our exit. Now, under the deal, the ECJ will still have the final say in some judicial cases where disputes occur. The EU will also prevent us from setting independent food and environmental policies. Now, future UK government would also be severely limited in its ability to modify its economic policy, which is ludicrous. Any state aid, for example, would be heavily restricted by the EU. In the same way, we would not be free to develop our own economic and trade policy. The EU, one way or another, directly or indirectly, would continue to have oversight of this. Now, is this taking back control? Is it? Because to me, it certainly isn't. Now, so taken together, this deal is a bad deal for our country. So what can we do next? Now, I've always been clear, a deal is preferable. But it's got to be a good deal. It's got to be the right deal for our country. Now, a deal that will give business the certainty they need and to invest in the future. However, the certainty for business should not come at the expense of weakening our democracy and a reduction in our sovereignty. That's why I do not fear a no deal under WTO terms. Now, I accept that this form of departure might not make the most sense from an economic perspective in the short term, but I remain a free market conservative. But the referendum was not just about economics. It was about giving people a real stake in their own lives, and it was about reclaiming our independence. Now, I'm just going to tell you a little story. In my constituency, which was Labour for 85 years, very working class, during the referendum, I was involved in the Leave campaign for all the 52 constituencies in Yorkshire. This gentleman about my age, 45, came up to me and he said, "I've never ever voted in my life before, but I'm going to vote to leave in this referendum." Now, that speaks volumes. He said, I feel that I've actually got a stake in our country and we can help shape the future. Now, if we let that person down, what does it do for our democracy? What state is our democracy? So this is what actually drives me on to keep pushing forward, really. Now, so the referendum was about reclaiming independence and, yes, about developing our own fair immigration policy. Now, this is the essence why so many people chose to vote Leave, and so no amount of scaremongering will change that passion for why people voted to leave. Now, this is why I've always been clear, the referendum result must be respected and it must be delivered. Now, even if the short-term disruption of our borders, and even if we upset the current British establishment, I don't care. We must deliver what we promised. This is because I prize democracy above all else, and our democratic system, fragile as it is only respected when people fully feel that they have a voice that can be heard, and they feel that they can make a difference in their own lives. Now, of course, it's easy for me to say, as I happen to believe that Brexit presents opportunities. Now, I also feel that our Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and key members of our government, they feel they inherited a problem with Brexit. They've never, ever seen this as an opportunity and never, ever seen it to chart our own way in the world and be, the Prime Minister, she made a Lancaster House speech about being this global free trading nation, and be really this guiding light for free trade. But this withdrawal agreement, how is that anything like that speech? So, this is why I was one of the first to call for the Prime Minister to resign, because we've seen, as the last few months have shown, that she cannot negotiate. Ollie Robbins cannot negotiate in the interest of our country either. So what I wanted was actually somebody in place who actually believed in our country and actually put our country first and actually had the business acumen, a bit like Martin said, who can negotiate in an actual logical way. I'm going to finish now because I think I'm running out of time. So we. Just to finish off, we should look to the east and embrace the titan economies of India and China, from which the majority of the world's future economic growth will come. We should look to Africa. We should look to Central and Southern America, and in doing so, we should capitalise on our many natural advantages: our English language, our Commonwealth, our legal system, our scientific excellence, our world-leading financial services, some which are in this room, our free and fair trade press, our military, our intelligence, our developed reach. Our great British brand, known throughout the world as a champion of democracy and a defender of individual freedoms. We must use all of these things to make a spectacular success of Brexit. Thank you.
There is a political crisis happening at the present time. So the crisis is really or the fact that the political classes are completely, or majority of them, out of tune with the electorate. When you get 75% roughly of constituencies, Labour and Conservative voting to leave, and the majority voting to leave the EU, and only about 150 MPs wanting to leave, that is the root cause of the crisis, that the elected representatives actually are out of tune with the people who elect them on this, the most important issue of our time. It's worth reminding ourselves that the referendum itself was unambiguous and unconditional. And what has been happening in the Commons and the Lords, although the Lords have been quiet recently, is that they have been trying to put conditions on what was an unconditional decision to leave the European Union, and trap us without any really rights into the institutions into the institutions that we voted to leave. And if I just go back before I get on to those institutions, the two great arguments in the referendum campaign were the argument about democracy, the simple argument of the 18th century in America and around Europe in the Enlightenment, that basically people who make the laws and raise taxes should be accountable to those people who are taxed. And if you ask me to say, I think that the Leave campaign won that argument, hands down. And if I can give an example like Andrea, I was out on the day of the referendum in one of the poorest estates in the United Kingdom, talking to people, an estate that has a low turnout. And a man came up to me, and like Andrea's person, he didn't vote regularly, and he said, "We're voting so that we can make our own laws, aren't we?" And I said, "Yeah, that's it. Can you think of a better definition can you think of a better definition of sovereignty than that we should be making our own laws?" And I think the answer is one can't. So I think we won that argument. I think because of Project Fear, we didn't do as well on the economic arguments. People were, the subject of that project, were frightened that jobs were going to go. And the argument that I don't think has been made strongly enough, that I would make now, it has been assumed as part of that idea that the EU was an economic powerhouse, that it was an extraordinarily viable organisation, rather than the fact it has been the slowest growing continental economy on the planet. And I think the argument that we need to make when we see these amendments coming in the EU, and we are making, is that the marriage between laws and regulations and the economy has to be intimate if we are going to be successful. And one of the arguments that I made during the campaign was that it took, I think, 18 years from memory, it's on the tip of my tongue during the campaign, to change the Clinical Trials Directive. Now, you may not be familiar with that, most people aren't, but because it took so long to change, we lost jobs, we lost progress in medicine over that period, because 28 countries had to agree to it. More recently, there was a ruling of the European Court of Justice on how you can change the genome of crops to make them more resistant to both fertilizers, to insecticides and to insects, so that you have to use less insecticide. And the ECJ stopped it. Now, we are a world leader in genetics, and yet we will lose that lead if that prohibition stays in place. And one can go back through the period of the EC and the European Union found case after case where the economy has been slowed down both by the slowness of making regulations and by the regulations themselves. So the two arguments that are being made to trap us into things is that somehow we should be completely aligned with the internal market. But what is the point of leaving if you're going to keep aligned to all those regulations and not be able to make laws and regulations that are good for our economy and help us to trade around the world? And secondly, and I simply do not understand the Labour Party's position on this, that we should be part of a customs union and be able to make our own trade deals. The basis of a customs union is you agree on tariffs across, and you agree that that customs union will make the trade deals for everybody. If this country is going to make its way in the world, then we have to be able to, with the parts of the world where most of the growth is predicted to come from over the next 20 or 30 years, as much as anybody can foresee that, but we have to be able to make our own trade deals with them, which even now is a majority of our trade. I want to finish really by saying three things, I think. One, Martin said it at the beginning, it is ridiculous to take no deal off the table. The Prime Minister really should, at the start of this process, have asked Len McCluskey for advice on how to negotiate. Nobody agrees to everything the other side wants at the start of a negotiation and walks away and says that it would be like trade unions negotiating with management and saying, we'd like a pay increase, but whatever you do, we're not going on strike. It is the most ludicrous position for any government to take. It is also pretty ludicrous for a Prime Minister to put into a deal, as both the previous speakers said, that we could only leave the agreement if the other side agreed. That deal was thrown out by 220 votes. It is an extraordinary comment on the state of our politics at the present time that a Prime Minister who puts something completely unacceptable into a deal, something that undermines rather than enhances our sovereignty, is still there. It's just extraordinary and in fact, whatever the resolution said that the House had confidence in the Prime Minister, all the other votes shows that is not, in fact, a reality. I wanted to mention Yvette's motion, because in a sense, Yvette's motion, although it wasn't worded like that and I voted against it, it will come back either next week or the week afterwards. I'm being rewired,
Anton, leave it now.
Yeah, so I'm about to finish. There are things wrong with the constitutional relationship between the executive and Parliament, and have been for some time. That requires detailed discussion, consultation, thinking through the issues, not doing it because that was what the Speaker thought when he got out of bed one morning. That is not the way to make constitutional changes. And Yvette's motion, which would transfer the initiative on legislation from the government to the floor of the House of Commons, is most likely, well, in effect, it is a vote of no confidence in the government, because if legislation after legislation was going through which the government disagreed with, how could they claim to be the government? So I don't think a general election is probable, but I think the arguments behind that make it possible. So I think a deal is better than no deal. It's been said before, but no deal is better than an appalling deal. And the crisis in democracy, if we don't if we don't carry through the will of the people, when all the parties said that the referendum would be honoured, the Prime Minister at the time said the people are sovereign, Labour's spokesperson said that it was up to the people, not the Commons, to decide. If we don't get out, if we don't do what the referendum says, then the constitutional crisis between Parliament and the people will become much more intense, and our politics probably won't be the same again anyway, but they will absolutely be changed fundamentally.
First of all, we need to understand properly where we are, and we need to go back to the beginning. The EU wants a deal in goods, we want a deal in services. They have a massive surplus in goods, we have a surplus in services. The net surplus is in their favour, and so they want a deal. They also, sadly, want to shackle our competitiveness, and that is how it is. And this was almost an extension of the debate in the 1990s over the social chapter, which Tony Blair gave away for nothing. He thought we were going to get reforms to the CAP, that didn't happen. But it's a rerun of those arguments. And unfortunately, embedded in the agreement in various subtle ways are chains and manacles which stop us being competitive. Not just the non-regression on social standards, which have, I deal in services, no real relevance to services, it's more for the industrial economy. Not just the environmental so-called environmental standards, which are actually to do with energy pricing, which makes us uncompetitive by having a higher energy costs than most of our competitors. But actually through the state aid rules, which apply in the transitional period, but also are applied ingeniously in the Northern Ireland backstop. One of my colleagues, just written something published last night with Sheila and Politeia, described it as a sort of joke first draft you'd send to someone in a negotiation, never expecting them not to redline it and send it back with thousands of amendments. We seem to have just signed it. So what those provisions do, effectively, is to give the Commission executive authority over state aid in Northern Ireland permanently, unless we agree something else, and why would they agree to anything else? And supervisory ability, control over our CMA's exercise of state aid control in Great Britain. And state aid, for those who aren't familiar with it, is not just about the industrial economy. It was introduced for the customs union, the idea being if you remove all your tariff barriers, you need something to stop other people in the zone subsidising unfairly their industries. Actually, the ECJ, which controls it and is a legislative body, it's little understood, but it is, has effectively extended that not only to services, but to tax policy and other policies. And it's a very politicised area of the law. It's sort of 10% law, 90% politics. The way it works is it gives the Commission a seat at the table to decide what to allow and what not to allow. Within the EU, by virtue of having commissioners and seats in council and so on, we can ameliorate it to some degree. But outside the EU, we have no protection at all. We're naked in the transitional period and under the Northern Ireland backstop, effectively sort of sitting ducks, if you like, whilst the EU can control our fiscal policy through these rules. And as an evidence for that, they've got 12 enforcement people in state aid in the Commission, 8 of whom have been transferred onto UK cases because they spotted that in the transition period we have no ability to push back, so they can basically stretch the perimeter as far as they want of state aid through us. There is no, by the way, reciprocity set of obligations, particularly in the NI backstop, requiring them to apply everything in the same way within EU 27 member states. There is nothing in the transitional period allowing us to take protective countermeasures in the event that the trade deal or there's no trade deal at the end where we have businesses exposed. So effectively in the transitional period, for instance in financial services, we will be applying all the EU rules, and they will be trying to attract business from the UK, and they haven't clarified exactly what they're prepared to agree to on financial services. I'll come on to that. And meanwhile, we can't say to businesses, oh, well, don't worry, if you don't get that, we will give you the following tax break. Because they will say, no, that's state aid, you can't do that. So it is a very, very dangerous setup as it's drafted. Just on financial services, I should say a few words about what is the way through on this. The way through is to actually achieve where we are now with the EU in terms of passporting for financial services, where you can operate under one set of laws and supervisory control across the whole of Europe, which is basically a removal of all the non-tariff barriers in financial services. It's one of the achievements of the EU, if you like. We can replicate that, but under another EU law concept of equivalence, by making some relatively minor enhancements. And I've shown how to do it in 2 Politeia publications, and that's been adopted by the UK government in its white paper, the post-Chequers white paper, and it's been adopted by the EU as well in the UK-EU political declaration. So they're already amenable to it, but they haven't agreed how much further to expand and enhance it from the existing baseline, and we should pin that down now. Because if we're going to have any transition for financial services, and I don't think we need one, I think we should move, given we're agreed we're going to do it, we should move to it now. But if we're going to have any transition, we should agree that we're going to have the same scope as the passport now. Otherwise, what we have in this period where we can't protect ourselves is them swinging back and forth across the channel, dangling the possibility that we get equivalence in particular sectors, whilst we can't take any protective steps. It's insane to agree to that. And therefore, it's key that we come out of it. Now, the good thing is they've already effectively, in principle, agreed to do this, and we need to fix that point. Finally, we need to shape up our own internal PR and legal analysis on all of this. There's been a stampeding effect on business of government-led and regulator-led ideas about the so-called cliff edge. And it's been wrongly analysed in law. I've published something explaining why. There are all sorts of reasons why there isn't a cliff edge for financial services, but there are people transferring businesses into the EU because they're worried about it, and our authorities are not pushing back on that, and this point has not been analysed properly, and the FPC, Financial Policy Committee, that first came up with this whole idea, had not looked at the 2 areas of law which actually show that it isn't a cliff edge, which are the ones I identified. And unfortunately, we're now in a situation, and this is true across the wider negotiations, where a lot of people have skin in the game and have their whole reputation staked on the analysis that we're applying. So for those people to accept that they got it wrong, not just got it wrong, but they've wasted an awful lot of people's money in responding to a situation unnecessarily, is a big deal. And I'm sceptical as to whether they're going to do it. So I do unfortunately think we need a very, very major shift to get back to a proper conversation and a proper negotiation, but it's not too late and it can be done.
We've heard from the panel today that while they would prefer a deal, a negotiated deal which respects the referendum decision, there are many options for the future which will set this country free. And we've heard from Graham about the economic downside, even the examples of the scientific problems that belonging to the EU has left us with, slowing down our economy. There's a lot to play for. There is a legal system in place, a bit of turbulence to start off, but who hasn't taken a bumpy flight? Once it settles down, one gets on with it and works hard. So I want to thank the panel and thank all of you for coming.